Night casts a misleading calm over a suburban Oakland neighborhood, the hum of distant traffic contrasting sharply with the chaos unfolding at one unremarkable house. Inside, the aftermath of a brutal family massacre lies in stark contrast to the public persona of the alleged killer. A respected activist once hailed for championing social justice, but now revealed to have concealed far more than personal struggles. If a figure so widely admired could harbor such explosive secrets, how many of us truly understand the fault lines that can fracture even the most trusted reputations? Welcome to True Crime Acts, where we uncover unsettling truths often hidden behind everyday life's normal routines. In this episode, we examine a story of concealed identity, intensifying distrust, and the dire consequences that can arise when secrets outpace understanding. If you find these insights compelling, please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss another exploration into the shadows lurking beneath seemingly ordinary encounters. Night settles on a quiet Oakland neighborhood, the glow of street lamps illuminating orderly sidewalks and trimmed yards. Inside this home, a gruesome discovery rattles even seasoned officers. An activist known for championing human rights and trans visibility has been arrested, accused of annihilating an entire household in a single burst of brutality. This same person once stood at podiums and marched in rallies, commanding respect from admirers who viewed them as a fearless advocate. Now, the same face is associated with murder, leaving the neighborhood reeling with unanswered questions. How did this public champion of acceptance and community morph into a figure of savage violence? Rumors swirl about deep personal rifts or mounting stress behind closed doors. Investigators methodically document every corner of the house, stepping over broken glass and half-burned objects. Neighbors gather beyond the tape, peering at the once harmless structure they'd passed countless times. In hushed tones, they recall seeing the activist come and go, always confident, always with a determined gait. The mismatch between that memory and the carnage inside this home terrifies them. For the individuals who were murdered, it appears they had connections to the activist, entwined paths overshadowed by a dark undercurrent. Confusion blankets the block. Could personal betrayals or resentments have brewed beneath an image of selfless activism? Or did the suspects snap under a weight of secrets tied to their own trans identity, spiraling into a moment of lethal rage? At the heart of the upheaval stands a contradiction that the community cannot ignore. A figure revered for fighting injustice is now handcuffed, suspected of a merciless family massacre. Did anyone sense the tension before it erupted? Or was it masked so thoroughly by the suspect's passionate calls for empathy that no one dared suspect an eruption of unthinkable proportions? Before the chaos, the suspect cut a striking figure at public events. Local newspapers profiled their efforts in championing trans awareness and rallying for equality in schools. People described the suspect as outspoken, at times abrasive, yet undeniably driven. They could stir hearts with speeches, arguing that society must open its eyes to the reality of marginalized lives. Yet perhaps in that unwavering energy lay cracks no one recognized. Behind that powerful stage presence, some acquaintances detected a simmering intensity. Friends remembered occasional outbursts when they felt undermined or opposed. They praised the suspect's courage, but also whispered about clashes with colleagues or abrupt resignations from committees. One moment, the suspect could charm a room full of supporters. The next, they might scald an opponent with biting words. In a tragic twist, the household that ended up at the center of the crime scene included individuals who'd known the suspect personally. Sources later claimed that the family had invited the activist into their home at times, forging a unique bond. Yet something unseen poisoned that relationship. Some rumored it was money disputes. Others whispered about emotional entanglements. Whatever the catalyst, the suspect's underlying rage eventually erupted one fatal night. Now that beloved persona, once the champion of acceptance, lay in shards. The legacy of activism had yielded headlines about betrayal and homicide, overshadowing the suspect's storied achievements. How had a tireless advocate for tolerance become entangled in a crime scene soaked in horror? Did the suspect's trans identity factor into a hidden emotional battle? Or was this monstrous act the product of a personality twisted by secrets too heavy to bear? The dichotomy confounded the public. and some felt the suspicion creeping. Had a lauded figure manipulated their cause for personal validation, never addressing a deeper reservoir of animosity? As scrutiny mounted, stories emerged of peculiar encounters with the suspect that hinted at hidden turmoil. A close friend described how the suspect sometimes spoke with scorching bitterness about perceived disloyalties, weaving conspiracies of betrayal by those they once considered allies. At social gatherings, they might dominate the conversation, rolling over polite attempts at dialogue with fierce monologues about injustice. Once, when teased about being overly dramatic, the suspect's mood reportedly darkened so swiftly it alarmed guests. These behavioral undercurrents, overshadowed by the suspect's activism, hardly seemed ominous enough for anyone to predict murder. Still, reading diaries found in the suspect's room, investigators encountered references to betrayal that can't be forgiven and retribution demanded for lies. The lines, scrawled hastily, suggested a mind preoccupied with vengeance, yet few had glimpsed these private confessions until it was too late. Meanwhile, the family at the heart of this tragedy was known for community involvement, friendly smiles, and open doors. Those who visited them recalled laughter in the kitchen, supportive advice for neighbors facing hardships, and an eagerness to extend hospitality. They, too, were activists in their own right, devoting time to charitable drives. That they could fall victim to such brutality at the hands of someone presumably aligned with their social beliefs shocked everyone. Police gathered accounts of friction between the suspect and the family, though the exact nature remained elusive. Some pointed to heated arguments concerning finances or personal slights, culminating in a sense that the suspect felt profoundly wronged. Others whispered that a more intimate dimension possibly fueled raging jealousy. No single detail entirely explained how a respected voice for unity had committed an atrocity that defied logic. Where did empathetic activism transform into violence? Could this be the savage outcome when someone invests so fervently in outward causes they neglect the storm gathering inside them? When the evening in question arrived, nothing suggested the horrors to come. Those inside presumably had no inkling that the visitor at their door, someone they had welcomed in times past, would bring a fatal escalation. The suspect arrived under the guise of talk or reconciliation, or so the subsequent investigation theorized. Police pieced together fragments of phone calls leading up to the meeting. But once inside, tensions erupted. Whether a dispute flared immediately or the suspect confronted them in a meltdown remains debated. In any case, the final moments saw a surge of lethal aggression that left the activist in a state of cold calculation. In addition to gunfire, attempts to destroy evidence by setting the house ablaze were clear signs of a plan that extended beyond mere panic. Outside, some neighbors heard shouting, followed by a sudden break in the yelling. Moments later, sirens blazed down the street. Officers, expecting perhaps a domestic disturbance, found a scene that would haunt them. Bodies lying in blood-spattered rooms, the air heavy with burnt plastic odor. The suspect, discovered in disheveled disarray, was quickly taken into custody. Shockwaves rippled. An advocate known for championing acceptance stood at the center of a murder investigation involving a family likewise committed to community good. Investigators realized that not only had this been a rampage, but an eerily methodical one. The suspect's chilling calm during arrest unnerved the responding officers. Some recounted that the suspect's face, while etched with stress, bore a certain resignation. How could genuine convictions about justice yield such brutality when personal grievances flared? If the suspect's trans identity once served as a beacon of perseverance, what had snapped so violently in that fateful confrontation with the family they once called friends or allies? Within days, the police publicly named the suspect, unveiling a past that included not just activism, but also long threads of personal strife. Officers who scoured the house uncovered ballistic matches indicating the suspect's firearm had been fired multiple times at close range. Accelerants and partial burn patterns confirmed an attempt to obliterate the scene. Spreads of blood spatter told a narrative of victims cornered with minimal chance to defend themselves. Forensic examiners found gunpowder residue on the suspect's clothing. Phone logs also revealed calls and texts from that day that highlighted a building tension. The suspect's final messages to the family contained urgent language. "We need to talk face to face. with some hinting at accusations of betrayal. Investigators saw these as potential preludes to a premeditated assault. Meanwhile, interviews with co-workers described an activist who seemed off in the preceding week. Restless, unusually short-tempered, muttering about people turning against them. The suspect's trans identity, thrust into media focus, ignited fierce debates. Some contended that any mention of it risked perpetuating harmful stereotypes, while others argued it was central to understanding the suspect's personal strain. The real question was whether that identity factored into the spree. Did self-conflict blend with anger toward the family, producing lethal aggression? Or had deeply personal resentments overshadowed everything, with trans identity merely a peripheral detail? In the eyes of many, the real heartbreak lay in the family's fate. They had devoted themselves to progressive causes, only to be murdered by someone they might have once deemed an ally. Amid the swirling evidence, investigators and onlookers probed one ultimate question. Was this crime the culmination of a single meltdown sparked by personal resentments? Or did it reflect a deeper, sustained plan to remove perceived obstacles? Share your opinions in the comments section, as both angles troubled the public, hoping the trial would bring clarity where confusion now dominated. After the initial search, authorities placed the suspect in custody. Questioned by detectives, the suspect maintained a defensive stance, offering vague commentary about being betrayed and pushed beyond reason. They claimed the family had wronged them but refused to detail how or why. Meanwhile, investigators pressed for specifics on the night's bloodshed. A line of questioning the suspect largely skirted. Rumors about the suspect's meltdown flew among legal circles. One detective recalled the suspect's eyes flickering with resentment whenever mention of the family's alleged betrayal arose. Some guessed finances might have been at issue, while others believed emotional entanglements led to violent obsession. The suspect's entire history as an impassioned activist now took on a grim subtext. The suspect's refusal to fully cooperate left a vacuum filled by evidence and speculation. Publicly, local groups that once hailed the suspect's activism distanced themselves. They released statements mourning the victims, condemning the suspect's alleged deeds, and urging the community not to conflate one individual's actions with the broader movement. In parallel, the suspect's lawyer tried to shape a narrative about a mental health crisis. Observers wondered if that was a ploy for leniency or a genuine explanation for behavior that defied logic. Outside the station, an impromptu vigil sprung up. Mourners demanded justice, their tears laced with disbelief that someone so publicly aligned with compassion could murder a family. Many worried the trial might become a media spectacle, sensationalizing the suspect's trans identity, overshadowing the real tragedy of the victims' lives cut short. Amid the swirl of rumors, one inescapable fact dominated each conversation. After leaving an indelible mark as a voice for acceptance, the suspect now faced evidence that pointed unequivocally to homicide. Could any explanation possibly align the noble cause they once championed with the terror they unleashed in that modest home? The trial's start unleashed an emotional tempest. Media coverage slammed viewers with repeated images. The suspect in earlier photos from protest marches or community fundraisers, now juxtaposed with mugshots capturing a blank stare. The prosecution wasted no time painting a portrait of brutal premeditation, citing ballistic data, attempts to burn the scene, and phone messages that revealed confrontational undertones. Meanwhile, the defense stressed a psychological breakdown, pointing to the suspect's letters documenting personal despair, conflicts over acceptance, and potential mental health crises. They argued that the suspect's identity as trans, while publicly lauded, had also trapped them in relentless internal turmoil. Could that turmoil have exploded in lethal anger upon discovering some final slight by the family? In the gallery, stunned observers wavered between sorrow for the victims and lingering shock that the suspect, so vocal about empathy, stood on trial for a triple homicide. Some recalled how the suspect once demanded accountability from local politicians. Others recalled short-tempered spats behind closed doors, overshadowed by the suspect's outward zeal. Each piece of evidence introduced, photos of bullet casings, recordings of frantic 911 calls, rattled everyone's sense of reality. Tensions tightened on the day the suspect's diaries were admitted as evidence. This personal commentary offered glimpses of layered resentments, culminating in talk about taking irreversible actions. The suspect's stoic gaze across the courtroom, as these words were read aloud, etched an eerie hush among the spectators. The dissonance between the diary's emotional extremes and the suspect's formerly eloquent public speeches amplified the tragedy. Could the jury, faced with such conflicting depictions of a righteous advocate turned accused murderer, find coherence? Or would they deliver a harsh verdict, convinced that no inner torment can absolve someone of planning and carrying out a savage assault on an unsuspecting family? Deliberations spanned days, every hour building anticipation. Finally, the jury re-entered the courtroom with somber expressions. They found the suspect guilty on all counts, first-degree murder. The judge emphasized that while personal issues or life challenges might explain a mental framework, they did not excuse calculated violence. A hush followed the reading of the verdict, broken only by muffled sobs from the victim's relatives. Outside, the press erupted. The suspect's defense counsel offered a statement of disappointment, maintaining that a meltdown rooted in psychological strain had been overlooked. Critics argued that no meltdown justified the methodical steps uncovered by investigators, the gunshots, the attempt to torch the house. Meanwhile, supporters of the family expressed relief that the legal system had recognized the severity of the loss. In the whirlwind of coverage, the suspect's trans background once again dominated sensational headlines. Advocates for LGBTQ+ rights grew frustrated, fearing the tragedy would fuel misconceptions about trans people as unstable or dangerous. They insisted that the suspect's identity was just one factor in a far more complex tale, a deeply troubled individual culminating in homicide. For the local community, a measure of closure came with the verdict, though it couldn't undo the family's absence. The talk soon shifted to the suspect's sentencing. Prosecutors pushed for life without parole, arguing the deliberate nature of the murders warranted no lesser punishment. The court faced the task of deciding how severe a penalty fit a trans activist found guilty of butchering an entire family they supposedly knew well. That pressing question highlighted an uncomfortable contradiction: how someone publicly advocating compassion could perpetrate such atrocity. Did the verdict imply that not even the noblest cause can offset a personal descent into violence, or was it an affirmation that justice must remain blind to any alleged moral accomplishments overshadowed by the darkest of deeds? When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom brimmed with tension. The suspect, clad in the same jumpsuit, had lost the resolute posture shown at the start of the trial. The judge, acknowledging the victim's family testimonies, delivered a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, a resounding condemnation that matched the brutality of the act. For some, the punishment represented justice served. It symbolized a firm repudiation of the suspect's lethal betrayal, ensuring society would remain safe from any repeat. Others sighed with the hollow recognition that no verdict could resurrect the cherished individuals struck down in their own home. The suspect's earlier accomplishments, petitions, campaigns for trans inclusion, progressive stances, seemed almost a distant myth, overshadowed irrevocably by the cruelty inflicted on that fateful night. Press coverage dwindled after the sentencing, replaced by new stories in the relentless news cycle. Those who had known the suspect before the murders struggled with confusion and shame, recalling how they once revered this figure's activism. Some felt anger at the betrayal, as if their trust had been manipulated. Meanwhile, surviving friends of the victims dedicated themselves to preserving the memory of the family, establishing memorial scholarships, and organizing community dialogues around mental health, inclusiveness, and the dangers of unacknowledged resentment. Debate continued among community members over whether the suspect's personal battles with acceptance or identity played a pivotal role in fueling the violence, or if this was purely a calculated crime born of intangible grudges. Regardless, the tragedy underscored that activism alone doesn't guarantee equilibrium or empathy within a person. The darkest corners of the human heart can stir even in those seemingly devoted to altruism. The story might fade from headlines, but it remains a potent example of how life's complexities can warp into lethal force when left unchecked, especially if hidden beneath the veneer of social justice. Did the suspect's anger fester behind applause and awards, waiting for the right trigger to explode? And what lessons can a community glean from a nightmare that started with a champion's face on a podium and ended in hushed funerals for 3 innocent people? Share your opinions in the comment section. In the subdued lull following the sentencing, the once prominent voice of activism lingered like a ghost in community memory. Some recalled the suspect's fiery speeches and constructive initiatives, but these recollections were drowned by the permanent stain of violence. For the victim's extended relatives and friends, grief remained a daily companion. They honored birthdays that would never be celebrated again, stared at empty chairs once filled by laughter, and wrote tearful posts on social media to keep memories alive. In interviews, a consistent theme emerged. They had hoped the suspect's battle for acceptance would also teach them empathy. Yet the betrayal revealed an unsettling reality that even the most lauded public figures can harbor explosive, private rifts. Local organizations re-examined how to approach activism that marries outward passion with inward stability. Some introduced workshops on identifying warning signs, whether related to mental strain, relational strife, or personal secrets. They reasoned that while no one could have predicted the suspect's turn to brutal homicide, honest conversations about inner turmoil might prevent tragedies in the future. Ultimately, the suspect's trans status proved a smaller piece of a much larger puzzle of rage, heartbreak, and alleged betrayal. Advocates cautioned that the horrific case should not overshadow the positive contributions from broader transgender activism. The suspect, once a formidable champion for marginalized communities, ended up exemplifying how unchecked emotional wounds can wreak irreparable damage. As night fell again on that quiet Oakland block, life resumed for many neighbors, some mowing lawns, some heading to early shifts. Yet the shadow of those killings cast a reminder that behind every fervent cause or charismatic face, complexities lurk. If society aims to prevent similar nightmares, it must be ready to offer genuine emotional support, not just applause, lest another story of outward heroism become a cautionary tale of hidden wrath. Night settles once more on the subdued Oakland neighborhood, a gentle breeze shifting the yellow crime scene tape that still clings to a battered fence. The house where the bloody rampage occurred looms behind it, windows dark and silent, casting a long shadow across the sidewalk. In the hush, neighbors pause momentarily as they pass, unable to forget that once a respected activist walked these very steps, only to unleash unimaginable violence on a family that had opened their door. It stands now as a stark reminder that beneath the most ardent proclamations of empathy or justice, deeper struggles can smolder if no one intervenes. Thank you for joining us on this episode of True Crime Acts. If you found this story both illuminating and compelling, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so we can continue to bring you stories of hidden conflicts, fractured lives, and the haunting outcomes that arise when secrets overwhelm even the loudest voices for change. In shedding light on these tragedies, we strive to spark conversations that might prevent the next calamity from unfolding in another quiet home before it's too late.